As Cheryl mentioned, throughout the month of February, we're going to grapple with the topic of prayer. I know it's not the most comfortable topic, but that's part of why we come to Tapestry. We come here to find comfort and hope and to be stretched a little bit sometimes. Now, prayer means 1,000 different things to different people. It's tempting to redefine prayer by watering it down into something that we can all appreciate. The problem with that strategy is that it would move far away from the way a lot of faithful people use prayer to communicate in a very personal way with God. So I'm not going to try to redefine prayer to make it more palatable. I do want to look at some of the different structures of prayer, though. My hunch is that for those of us who are agnostic or even atheists, some of the forms of prayer that people find useful might be helpful to us too. So today we're focusing more on different structures of prayer. In a week or two, I'll talk more about content of prayer that might serve us as Unitarian Universalists. So one of my favorite theological conversations with friends was just about this topic, about the structure of prayer. It actually sounds a little bit like a joke. A Unitarian, a Methodist, and a Muslim walked into a bar. And somehow the three of us got into a conversation about prayer. The two of them were absolutely baffled by the other person's prayer life. For Muslims, prayer is largely about reciting particular passages from the Quran or other pieces of writing. You don't just think up a prayer, you read it, or you say it from memory, things that you may have memorized since childhood. This couldn't be more different from the way United Methodists typically pray. For them, prayer is basically an extemporaneous conversation with God. There's no text to memorize, it just flows from your heart. So both of my friends, both actively religious people, were baffled by the other's prayer life. For my Muslim friend, a free-flowing conversation with Allah seemed way too casual. For my Methodist friend, she thought, how can someone else's words express my joy and my grief? I can't possibly open my heart with someone else's words. I think we can learn a lot from the way different prayers are structured, like recitation. That's the typical style of prayer for my Muslim friend. It's, as the word suggests, reciting a particular set of words. In recitation of prayer, we use written words to communicate with God. And that usually involves some amount of gratitude or asking for assistance or praise. But recitation as a spiritual practice isn't just limited to prayer. We actually use it every Sunday morning here together in our services. Very rarely is it a prayer that we say together. Things like the unison affirmation, the congregational response to sorrows and celebrations, and the responsive reading are all recitations. And I know that's not the most comfortable thing for some of you. Unitarian Universalists don't like being told what to say. So here, publicly, before everyone, I'll be clear. You don't have to read every word in front of you. You don't have to sing every word of every hymn. If you disagree with the content, feel free to skip those words. Heck, skip the reading, skip the hymn. I have no interest in coercing you into saying things that you don't believe. But if it's not the content of the words themselves, if you bristle simply at the practice of reciting something aloud with others, I want to challenge you a little bit. Reciting words is an exercise to orient our hearts and minds. Just like prayer, those words are carefully chosen to reflect the values of our community. The language seeps into our own vocabulary eventually and provides a framework for our own beliefs. This is a bit of a strange comparison, but I'm reminded of my days as a Boy Scout and the Scout law that we recited together. A Scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. The Scout law is really a list of virtues. It's sort of a way to check in on your own actions and your own character. But it's there in my subconscious, years and decades, later. So without hesitation, I say that I hope that the words that we recite together will also seep into your subconscious, to dwell together in peace, to seek truth and love. We join you in celebration. May the caring of this beloved community sustain you. I hope those phrases stick in our hearts. And reading them together is part of the experience, especially in a faith community. Now, affirming the goodness of life and the value of compassion are great on your own, but when we read them together, we share the burden of those words. Some weeks, we individually run low on hope. Some weeks, by the time Sunday gets here, we may be all out of compassion in our tanks. But when we hear 100 people around us reading those words with us, we're reminded that the world is not on our shoulders alone. You aren't just reading for yourself. You're also reading for the people around you. Now, recitation isn't just something that we do together. It's something that people do alone, too, maybe in the form of a mantra or an affirmation. Those are probably the simplest tools for meditation and prayer that I know of. It's the reason that I'm such a fan of them. And you don't have to start from a cool, calm, and collected place of silence. Just the opposite. They're tools for when your mind is spinning in 1,000 different directions. They're tools to get to that place of focus. Short, simple statements that you can say in your head or out loud. Often, mantras are connected with breathing. One of the ones that I use when I'm stressed out is breathing in calm, breathing out peace. Breathing in calm, breathing out peace. You may do it for 2 breaths. You might spend 20 minutes to move into a much deeper sense of peace and calm. It all depends on what you need and how much time you have. Have you ever seen the t-shirt or bumper sticker that says, "Prayer changes things"? There was a guy that wore this in Laguna Beach all the time. Nearly every time I see it, my knee-jerk reaction is sort of an angry dismissal of what I assume is a very different theology from my own. But usually, eventually, I remind myself that prayer does change the heart and mind of the person doing it. At the very least, prayer changes the person. And mantras and affirmations have a tremendous power to change things too. They aren't going to cure everything that ails us. They won't make us younger. They're not going to make our dream job fall in our laps. But using mantras or affirmations can dramatically improve our state of mind and give us the courage to pursue those things or deal with those things. There's another type of prayer that we might learn from that you may not have heard of unless you come from a Catholic background. It's called Lectio Divina. That's divine reading in Latin. Lectio Divina started as a way of reading Bible passages. A monk came up with it in the 12th century, and many Catholics still practice it today. It's a 4-stage process, And the first stage is lectio, or reading. That just means reading the passage slowly and letting it sink in. We're pretty familiar with that, of reading a text that we care about slowly. The second stage is reflection. It's time to think about that text in an analytical way. Who was the author? Who was the intended audience? What are the possible meanings? What words jump out at me? The idea is to pull information out of it. And the third stage is response. This stage takes the reader to a more personal level. In this stage, we set aside that critical analysis and simply let our hearts open to the experience. How are we responding emotionally to these words? And then the fourth stage of Lectio Divina is rest. It's one step deeper. In this stage, we let go of our ideas, even let go of our emotional response. The idea is to rest and find comfort in the passage. In that moment of letting go, we settle in a little deeper. So the example that I would give you is probably our Unitarian Universalist phrase, the interdependent web of life. It's a fascinating concept just to think about in terms of what we know about ecology and sociology. And when we reflect on that connectedness, there's an emotional response, for sure. Perhaps the most underutilized way of appreciating that phrase is to rest in it. To rest in the peace and knowledge that a web of life supports us in every breath. So those four stages of Lectio Divina are just guidelines of how reading a text can develop. It's a movement toward greater simplicity with less talking and more listening. Gradually, the words of the text begin to dissolve and the meaning is revealed in our hearts. Lectio Divina obviously was created as a way of reading passages of the Bible. If that's meaningful to you, use it. If you find poetry or Buddhist inspiration more helpful, use that. You could even use this four-step method to appreciate visual art or music. The point of Lectio Divina, and what I want to invite all of us to do, is to occasionally slow down. Spend time with a piece of inspiration, experience it in your mind and your heart, and to finally rest in it. I want to very briefly mention one last structure of prayer, I suppose. It's prayer that uses objects. Probably the most classical example of that is the rosary. In Catholic life, each bead reminds the user of a short prayer to recite. We already talked about recitation, but we haven't talked about the way objects can be useful. And we Unitarian Universalists have a beautiful, simple, universal object in our flaming chalice. We light one every Sunday morning. We also light one before a lot of our committee meetings. Some of us light a chalice at home. It's an easy way of marking a time as sacred or apart from the usual. You could use one for your spiritual practice, or before a special meal, or with kids before bedtime. It's a beautiful, simple ritual, and you can buy a chalice or a candle holder shaped like a chalice just about anywhere. Probably the dollar store has them. There are all sorts of objects that can help us find focus. Lynn Cowan is a big fan of walking labyrinths as a form of meditation. She can tell you where there's an amazing one in Laguna Niguel. Perhaps carrying a touchstone in your pocket was helpful. Some call it a worry stone. It's not to induce worry, but they're there in your pocket so that at a moment's notice, you can reach in and be reminded of that sense of hope or grounding that stays with you. Prayer looks like 1,000 different things and serves many different purposes. Probably one of the most often used prayers in America is the Serenity Prayer. It's engraved on the hearts of most people who have found sanity through 12-step programs. It says, "God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." Whether it is in conversation with God, conversation with the earth, or conversation with yourself, that perspective is what we're looking for. To slow down, to recognize our own tremendous power, and to let go of what we don't have the power to change. For some, it makes sense to ask God for help on that journey. For others, perhaps for you, another practice makes more sense. Whatever your practice is, whatever our understanding of God is, we can learn a lot from the ways men and women around the world have prayed and their understanding. Amen.